Tim Ryan with the Superintendent's Association. Tim, welcome, and I want to thank you and the superintendents for helping and prepare for a lot of this, and surely some work that we're going to be asking you and the team to complete in advance, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator Pearson, members of the committee. We will do anything we can for the benefit of our kids. First of all, thank you for taking a look at this. This is the perfect time, now that the funding formula has been fully implemented over the period. We really need to take a look because things have changed. I think one of the things, and I really appreciate the analysis that was brought out here. One of the things is the whole idea of what's the core and what's not in the core. And the question that came up very appropriately was how Woonsocket was highlighted. Woonsocket got $13 million about in state aid. That's total state aid. And when we look at what's in the core and what's not in the core was $500,000 to Senator De Palma's point in ESSA transportation. This is the new requirement of the Every Student Succeeds Act, and it's a good thing. It says that children under DCYF care should remain in their school of origin. Makes a lot of sense. If I'm a high school kid and I've lived my whole life in Woonsocket, and because of family problems, I have to move in with my grandmother in Coventry, what makes more sense than to transport that student back to the school of origin where they have stability, friends, and the like? No problem, philosophically. But the problem is, there's no money. Woonsocket, the district that can least afford it, has to come up with $500,000 just to meet the requirement of ESSA transportation. So Senator Palma was right on with this. This is a critical issue. And I think philosophically we make the idea that we have the core that's required and the non-core that's discretionary. Well, this isn't discretionary. This is a federal requirement that the state is appropriately working. And we've worked closely with Rhode and DCYF on this to make sure we have good guidelines that these kids are taken care of. But it is a change philosophically and a change in reality, and it's a big financial change from when we first developed the formula. So I really appreciate that issue coming up. I think that's very, very important. Another major issue that's changed, and I think we have to take into account, is that the funding formula is a tremendous improvement. I started teaching in Rhode Island in 1972, and to have a predictable, common sense formula is a huge improvement, and I'm really grateful to the legislature for taking that on. But one of the other things is there are many other decisions that are made, both at the state and municipal level, but primarily at the state level, that impact how the funding formula really works. When this funding formula was developed, we basically, when we think of career and tech education, we think of regional centers, whether they be Davies, Aquidneck Island, Cranston, Warwick. These were regional career and tech centers where kids would pool from other districts to go. Well, there's been a big change, and I'm not saying a bad change, but a big change, because now we have school-based CTE programs. And a lot of these are fantastic programs. They're a benefit to kids. But the decision was made by the Department of Ed that districts are responsible for any CTE program that a student wants to attend. The district of residence pays the tuition costs, even if they have the same program within the district. So this has had huge fiscal impact. City of Warwick stands to have to expend nearly $3 million a year for CTE tuitions, and they have a regional CTE center in their district. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I think it's great that we look at this and provide more opportunities for kids, but we have to have a fiscal backstop to look at this. When we create new programs, we have to say, what's the fiscal impact? So this is a decision that was made that hugely impacts districts and drastically affects our ability to meet the needs of the kids in supplementing the core and even providing the core. So I really appreciate the fact that you've looked at this. A few years ago, there was a commission appointed by the governor to look at charter school tuitions because there are We looked at the per pupil funding there. When we look at the law for charter schools, for example, requires that when a student leaves a district, as you referred to, Senator Pearson in Providence, the per pupil cost goes as a tuition. And this, on the face of it, looks completely fair until we start to realize that say in Middletown, for example, the per pupil cost is $15,000. Well, of that $15,000, $1,000 is pension. $1,500 is out-of-district special ed tuition. Another $1,000 is for CTE education. Another $500 is for early childhood expenses. So really, what's being spent on a child in Middletown is $12,000 for core instruction. When that child goes to a charter school, they get the $15,000. I'm not saying that they're not doing a good job. I'm not saying people shouldn't have a choice, but I think we need to relook at that, particularly when we look at high-cost special education, and really look at where the numbers are, what the impact is. Kelly referred to that. There's a number of things that were well-intentioned. In terms of group home aid, that was put in to address an issue at the time. We have a different landscape now with ESSA. I really appreciate the fact that you identified Pawtucket and Woonsocket as districts that I think kind of got the short end of the funding formula, particularly in light of the community ability to raise resources. I think you're right on when we have to look and say, what is local contribution? What are the requirements of the local communities? We do have political challenges around the state, and some communities have been really oriented to taking care of their schools. Some have not. How do we address that? And I think we have to look at, say, as we look at what's part of the core and what's not, I think we have to look at the over-reliance on categoricals. I didn't want to get too much in the weeds, but I think it's really important to look at the funding formula is great. It's good. It makes sense. But other decisions we make have huge impact on the net effect to districts that we have to take into account as well. So I want to thank you very much for this work. The time is right. Anything that superintendents can do to help, any information we can provide, we're happy to do so.
Senator Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tim, I also address, and they're all positive programs. Same thing with the PTECH program. They're phenomenal. They are by far a step up for Rhode Island in what we're doing with them. Clearly, they're definitely familiar with the cybersecurity one at Rogers. I think it's the #1 in the state, I think, from a attraction perspective and what it's going to produce. Categorically the right thing to do. We need to figure out how does that factor in, as you said, with the CTE program. And may he rest in peace. I think Paul Crowley had the initiative at one point of having regional career and tech ed centers. I think that horse has left the barn with regards to establishing those in comprehensive high schools, which is, I think, a good thing as well. But how does that factor into the notion 10 years ago when we were looking at career and tech ed? And because we didn't talk about Davies here, we didn't talk about the Met School, and they're separate, and they should be separate because they're different and unique, and they have unique challenges and unique entities there. So that should be there. The one piece I want to go back to, and I maybe correct what you said. So, Chairman, with regards to the funding for charter school, retirement's not a part of that. I thought it was just the core and student success factor numbers, that the other things are not a part of that, because otherwise transportation, everything else would be a part of it.
They get a per pupil share of the local contribution. So the local contribution would cover the local non-core and the local share of the core. Whatever that is that the district actually spent.
At the local
level, whatever they actually spent, you divide that by that district's enrollment, and that becomes the local share that the district has to write the charter.
So in the case of, I'll just pick out Providence for a second, which has a low local share, it's much different there than it is in
Correct.
Barrington, let's say.
You are correct. I probably was misleading with my comment, because that, when I said the 15,000, that was including state and local share. You are correct. I'm not picking on you, but I just want to make sure as people hear about that, we listen about it. We all listen about it. They mean certain things to folks, but there's certain changes and decisions that have been made both by the legislature and Rhode over the last 9+ years that do in fact affect the formula that need to be looked at. And your point about the PTECH program, North Providence is a dynamic program. These are critical opportunities for our kids, and to me, they're part of the core.
And I think, Senator, just to follow up on your point there, I think at the end of the day, the amount per community that is sent for a charter seat is different, right? And it's different in two different ways. So the state share is always just the state share, right? So the state may be sending, $8,000 for a Providence student, but only $2,000 for a Cumberland student, because Cumberland sends, right, the inverse of that equation, because Cumberland sends more money out of local dollars because more of that core is funded. So the net amount by community that is sent is the full amount of that cost, right? But it can be different as to how it's paid. Some of it more out of state money, some of it more out of local money. Right. The only differentiator is because the local share is calculated based on the core and non-core. If a community significantly overfunds their core and non-core, the local share of that check is going to go beyond the core and non-core. Whereas on a district that is underfunded on the core and non-core, the local share is going to be a bit less, but the state share is going to be the same. And particularly in communities like Providence or Pawtucket, or even Woonsocket that have, not Woonsocket doesn't have that big of a charter population, but Providence and Pawtucket do. What you'll see there is that the state share of that is a significant sum and automatically goes, even though the local side of that rest of that core isn't funded. And so the charter is getting 100% of that core amount, even though the student that they attended that district, they were never getting 100% of that core amount attending Woonsocket or Providence schools. So it's one of those things that I think not only is it the cost side of it, it's the nature of, because we allow underfunding of the core and the formula the way it's structured, we're just exasperating the same problem. So, any other questions for Tim? Senator Murray?
Not a question, more of a comment. I wanted to thank you and also thank Senator DePalma, because I know that Senator Picard would have brought this up also. But, when I met with the school committee chair and the financial director of the school, and they brought up transportation as just a huge cost, and having to it's so important to keep those kids in district, but that amount that it costs Woonsocket for transportation and Woonsocket's ability, the disparity between that amount and then Woonsocket's ability to pay is huge. And you talk about non-core, but yet it is essential to keep kids where, with their in their district, to keep that continuity, particularly for those children who are in DCYF care and who might be in the care of others. So I want to thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you. One other, I think, intended consequence of ESSA, as we think about DCYF, and we've talked about this during the various meetings we've had, I think we're going to see DCYF looking to place, because we talked about transportation within a region is paid for by the district. So whatever region you're in, you pay for that, and looking at how does the state maybe pick up the costs outside the region. Well, as DCYF is going to look to place children, youth, whatever, in a particular house somewhere, if the state's now accountable for that cost, money speaks volumes. DCYF may be looking at it and say, okay, how do I keep the child in Newport County? If it's Newport, or whatever the bus region for Newport County is, or Providence County, or whatever. I think that's going to drive their behavior as well. So in the case of what we're seeing in Senator Picard would talk about, that will be a factor that hopefully we can help ameliorate. We still want the child to be in the best place it can, but how do you balance some of that if possible?